Welcome to the Outback Incubator, home of the future of work, industry and people, with your host, I4O's Oliver Kelly.
Welcome to today's episode of the Outback Incubator. We are filming from Brisbane Square Library today due to the weather in Brisbane. We've come through a season of fire and drought, and now we have flooding in northern New South Wales. But we're here, and we're very fortunate today to be able to interview somebody who in so many ways embodies the intent of this podcast series of the Outback Incubator. Welcome, Dr. Richard Hames, to the podcast. Thank you so much. Dr. Hames is a strategist, CEO of the Centre of the Future, chairman of the Asian Foresight Institute, mentor to various heads of state and CEOs, elected fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science. So thanks again.
It's a pleasure.
It's quite a list of accolades. And I understand that you have 10 children as well. So how on earth do you find the time?
10 children and now 15 grandchildren as well.
Incredible. Incredible.
Big family.
Yeah.
But they're all over the place.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you must travel a lot, obviously.
I travel a lot. I hardly ever see them.
Yeah.
But I travel for business, yes.
Right. Well, look, we've got a lot to cover today. We're probably going to go backwards and forwards. Let's just see how the discussion goes. What I didn't want to do was give you the typical introduction that I have seen in many of the interviews that you go through. People tend to say futurist, person with predictions. Now, let's be fair, a lot of the predictions that you have provided in regards to major world events that have occurred, you predicted way before then.
Yes.
But I know that that's not the single thing that you do as such. There's a lot more to it. So I understand you don't really like the term futurist too much. So how does that fit in with what the Centre for the Future actually does, and why is that?
Well, there are two things there. I don't like the label futurist. In fact, I never called myself a futurist. I was more concerned with trying to understand what's happening today and then gain insights in terms of what might happen because of that. The Centre for the Future's mission is really to redesign the human presence on Earth because so many systems are in a state of collapse, life-critical systems that we probably take for we take for granted, like the global economy, health, education, food, water, energy, basic systems that were redesigned, and politics as well, and democracy. I mean, democracy is not working anywhere in the world. But these systems were designed for another era. And in the year I was born, for example, in 1945, there were 2 billion people on the planet. And it seemed empty. It felt really empty, the world. And now we've got 7.7 billion people, and yet those systems haven't changed. The design is still the same, which is why a lot of them are beginning to fail. It's not just numbers, but to a great extent that those numbers impact systems, the efficiency of them and whether they're able to produce what everyone wants them to produce. And as they fail, of course, we start blaming each other. It doesn't matter if you're different in some way. You might wear different clothes or eat different food or worship a different god. Then we can blame each other, and we're doing that to such an extent that then at the individual level there's a crisis of consciousness simply because there's increased levels of anxiety, loneliness, depression. And it's getting to that stage where we have to redesign the systems that otherwise just keep us in that loop of producing more and more stuff, throwing it away when we don't want it, believing that that's how the world works. Well, it can't work like that.
I thought a lot about this, and I kind of thought about this analogy of it, which is it's almost like we've stubbed our toe. We've got this momentum moving forward, and the systems and the constraints, as you say, it's like a bottleneck for us to really be able to get the best out of the progress that we've made. But we're leaning into that fall, and we're kind of falling over ourselves because, well, look at the incredible technology developments that we've got today,
Yes.
editing the human genome. I read a book by Yuval Noah Harari, and he
Yes.
said it's like everything up to now has been a dress rehearsal for this moment. But we're leaning into that fall, it seems. We're not really preparing ourselves to be able to regain our balance. And how do we do that in such a short space of time?
It's a good question, and the nub of that question is whether we're wise enough to survive our own success.
Yeah.
Because as a species, we've been immensely successful, and there's an arrogance about thinking that we can keep on doing that. But when the external environment is changing to such a degree, then we have to adapt. We have to change, and whether we can change fast enough is the question. Because, again, a lot of our systems, and you take democracy as a good example, are slow in responding to the external environment, slow in responding to the complexity of the world today. So it's not just a question of are we wise enough to survive our own success, but can we actually do it fast enough? And a lot of people would say, well, look at our technologies. Technology can be the panacea, it can be the saviour for our species. And that's a flawed argument, because the technology now is getting, with artificial superintelligence, which is the moment machines become as smart, if not smarter, than humans, then actually we don't know what will happen. Are we creating a new species? Is it a species that will be kind to us, especially if we're not actually coding that species at the moment in a way that says do no harm to humans, for example. So there are a lot of unknowns, and the technology is certainly running at a faster rate than the human ability to keep up with that in terms of speed and complexity particularly.
You know, I saw those videos from Boston Dynamics, which is incredible what they do.
Yes.
And it's almost like a science fiction movie, and it's a window into the near future for us. But what I struggle with is the videos where they're testing. They have to test how it works, but for the cameras, they're pushing it around and they're tripping it up. And this is becoming a form of intelligence, and if it does move to general intelligence, is that just another animal, you know?
Yes.
And there's just something I'm uncomfortable with about watching those videos,
Yes.
because it's almost like it's showing us the cruelty of humanity,
Yes.
and we're just doing it to something that we've created.
My kids laugh at me because when I'm in a car park and paying at the machine that you put your ticket in and you put your money in, etc., I always say thank you to the machine, because I say to my kids, you never know.
Yeah.
And certainly everything's becoming, with the so-called Internet of Things, everything is becoming digitally interconnected. And so you have this networked intelligence, like cells in the brain, which are dumb in themselves, but when they're connected, they're a brain, they're a network. And at what point does that network become sentient, like human beings?
Yeah. So you talk about the expanded now a lot.
Yes.
Could you just expand a little bit on exactly what that means?
Yeah. So I mean, when we were looking at how to slow down time, because the future is a really interesting concept because it doesn't exist. And it's the now that's important, and we make decisions in the now based on what we know about the past. The future is something that is entirely speculative, and of course it comes at us and then it's the present and then it's gone again. So we were trying to work out how to slow time down, because in a quantum sense you can't do that. Time simply doesn't exist. So how do you conceptually slow time down sufficiently that you can pull information from the deep past into the present, and at the same time you can pull possible information from the deep future into that present, so that you can examine all of that in a new kind of awareness of how things interact and collide. And so it's become the space, if you like, in which we examine possibilities for the future based on the present.
And so with the predictions that we talked about earlier, that's really that process that you went through. You would have taken various data sources, historical
very much
facts,
historical.
and then start to not mould them, but see which channels they start moving down.
Yes. Yeah, can I tell you what the process is?
Please,
first?
yeah.
So nowadays, I mean, it's interesting because I was giving an opening keynote this morning at the convention centre. Even just a few years ago, that work of preparation for any topic about the future, it would take a team of 2 or 3 people working with me, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks, to prepare the information. Now we use an algorithm which scans literally hundreds of millions of documents that are available online in the public domain. And so we ask a question: what is the future of the law? What is the future for rural Australia, which I was talking about this morning? You ask a question of the algorithm, and the algorithm spews out in minutes, perhaps 30, 40, 50 sheets of raw data about that question. It can come as maps, words, diagrams, more questions. What we do with that, we've got about 3,000 trusted sources around the world who have their own insights and perspectives on the future generally, and we throw that at those people. We'll normally get back between 250 and 300 responses for any question, depending on their interest. And then by that time we're crafting different stories using that data. And then if we see running across all those stories a similar issue or the same factor occurring again and again and again across 4, 5, 6 narratives, we start waving flags and say, hey, we've got to pay attention to this because it looks like if we don't change things, these are the possibilities. And that's when the predictions come out. So the predictions really are not always there, and they come when the evidence is so glaringly obvious that we say, if we don't change things in this respect, then the likelihood is that these things will happen.
It's incredible. It's almost like a reflection of what's going on around us in terms of big data.
Yes.
And just feeding all of that back in to learn and improve.
That's right.
It's just a sort of very high-level version of that, I suppose, isn't it?
It's very much an iterative process too, because we go through, we ask different questions, so we get raw data, and then we think, well, hang on a moment, this doesn't make sense, or how can we clarify what this means? Feedback a different question. So the power of the question is really important, because normally in business and government we ask pretty closed linear questions, black or white questions, yes or no, on or off, black or white. The questions we ask are more open than that. I was going to say more complex, and they're complex in the sense that we try to ask questions that open inquiry rather than close it down. So we're always looking for more and more information until there is enough. We've got sufficient information to then craft some stories, then iterative in the sense that we feed back those stories and say to the algorithm, what about this story? What about this story? What are the probabilities involved in this? And so recently, for example, last year, I had predicted publicly the assassination by drone of a world leader. And we'd done that on the basis that various nations have what I can only refer to as kill lists. The US particularly, out of the Pentagon, has a list of people it would prefer not to be leading a nation or not to be so influential in the way that leader is. And then 3 days into this year, of course, we had the assassination in the Middle East and in Syria of the Iranian more than a general, actually. Soleimani was much more than a general, very influential. And he was one of the people on the list we had of likely targets or but not actually in the top 3. So the question for me now is, what does the prediction become? And I still think the prediction is relevant as drones are miniaturized and accuracy and precision becomes greater. The possibility of targeting an individual in the world, not necessarily in the Middle East, but with a degree of accuracy and precision that a miniaturized drone can just deliver poison into the neck. I mean, it's that accurate. Then that prediction is still open. When? I don't know when that'll occur, but it will occur at some stage. Just like the virus stuff at the moment that we've got going on. It's becoming a pandemic. A pandemic is absolutely certain at some stage to wipe out millions of people. Is this the one? We don't know.
Could be a sign of something worse to come. Yeah, that's right.
Very much so.
And with the drone that you're talking about, the miniature, like that technology's around at the moment, is that right? That exists at the moment?
They exist at the moment, and when you apply swarm technology to autonomous weapons, autonomous drones, in other words, they're talking to each other, they don't have to be guided by instructions from you or me, and they know the target, then that's not science fiction anymore, that's happening, that's being worked on by various research institutes, and the major one being DARPA, which is the research arm of the Pentagon. But there are similar institutes and similar work going on in China, in Israel, and in a number of places all over the world.
When that was all happening between the US and Iran, I was talking with a good friend of mine, and he was saying that the Google search rate for the draft in the States went up by 300 or 3,000% or something that weekend. So people were clearly concerned because a lot of people they sign up to the draft, and that actually affects their student loan allowances, etc. in the States.
Yes.
And we had a long discussion about it, about would a large-scale land war likely ever happen again in the world with all of the technology that exists? Like, how do you see that going? Is that likely to ever occur again, do you think?
No, probably unlikely. I put this to a group of young cadets at one of the military academies in the US a couple of years ago, and asked them to work on alternative possibilities to the kind of wars that exist at the moment and have done in the past. And one group was very interesting, came up with the notion that because of the futility of war now, I mean, it's absolutely pointless. In every aspect. Economically, it's pointless. In terms of acquiring territory, it's pointless. It actually backfires on you. I mean, given that the US has been at war for the past 6 decades, and look at the state of the US now, look at its infrastructure, look at its education program, look at the healthcare available to how many Americans. I mean, that's why there's so much division in the US itself these days, because in terms of domestic quality of life, it's much lower than it was. And so they came up with this notion that we would go back to the idea of gladiators representing symbolically the warring parties in a coliseum, or even virtually, and that it would become actually part entertainment, but very serious in terms of winners and losers, but not to the extent that land would be degraded or people would be killed. It was very clever and very insightful, potentially.
Well, all those gamers that we say they're doing nothing with their lives, maybe they're the warriors of tomorrow then.
That's right, absolutely.
It's certainly a skill in itself, I believe.
Yes.
Well, that's fascinating insight, certainly. One of the things I did want to ask you, so I spoke with my eldest last night, who's 11 years old, and the rain was coming down on our steel roof, and I love that sound because it makes me very grateful for having a roof.
Yes.
And he couldn't sleep because of it, and he knew that I was going to interview you today.
It was loud, was it?
Oh, it was unreal.
Thunderous.
It sounded like a tsunami coming in.
Yes.
And so I said I've got the interview with Dr. Hames tomorrow, and because I've talked to him about that. And so I said, if you, as an 11-year-old, could ask someone who has their finger as much as possible as anyone really could on the pulse of where we're at today and where we're going, what would you ask him? And so he said, I'd ask, who's going to win, the polluters or the protesters? That was his question. Now, he's not saying that he's just got that from the media, okay? But I found it quite profound that an 11-year-old would ask that question, because the concept of dualism is there straight away. Yes. And I said to him, remember, there's a whole heap of people in the middle as well, and I think balance needs to be remembered as a vehicle for us, you know, I wouldn't say those words. But it showed me that it's not an anxiety for him, but it's an awareness or a consciousness that we're really on the cusp of something big here and we have to do something.
It may not be an anxiety for your son, but it's certainly an anxiety for many, many more people today. The World Health Organization estimates last year, I think, or the beginning of this year, that in terms of global GDP, we lose roughly somewhere between 1.5 and 2 trillion US dollars in lost productivity because of mental health issues. And in Australia, the latest from McKinsey, the latest stats on young people that leave work or leave their jobs, and 75% of those cases, the reason is a mental health reason. So there's an anxiety actually palpable, it's hanging in the air, and this is giving rise to this youthquake that we're seeing everywhere, where what was, if you like, polite activism is now pushing into civil disobedience. And that, I think, will continue. It will continue to expand and accelerate until governments and corporations alike are forced into making the change, because the future belongs to these people, it doesn't belong to my generation. And there is no institution, no organisation in the world today that would not benefit from reform of some kind, especially in terms of response to what's happening.
It's obviously in the hands of world leaders, but it's in the hands of the people as well, isn't it? And I suppose what I've heard you talk about that a lot, and it's not that I disagree with it, I actually agree with it. But the bit in the middle for me is, how do we affect that change in such a short space of time? Like, we've got these 2050, the oceans will be depleted. It's not a defeatist mentality, but it's just
it's a realism.
How do you project manage that in terms of billions of people?
It's realism. Let's go back to the notion that leaders lead, because I think possibly there's a leadership vacuum globally in terms of incumbent leadership. The problem seems to be that the nation state, or the sovereign state, and certainly corporations in the system of capitalism which we've invented, are designed to compete. And they are designed to compete in a world which is ever growing. And growth has become a cancer. It's a cancerous growth now. And it's toxic. And capitalism has become more and more predatory over the past 50 years. And because capitalism was brilliant, I mean, it has given us so much. It's been an extraordinary invention, but no longer is it extraordinary. It's actually backfiring on us and is toxic, has become toxic and predatory and extractionist. And so incumbent leaders, and I work with a lot of them, are actually aware of the situation they're in, but do not know how to get out of that system where they're expected to compete, in corporates expected to get profits, expected to create shareholder value. There is no concept that perhaps human well-being and endurance is as important as money. So that's one thing. The question of who will prevail is interesting, because the younger generation are getting more and more resentful of the future we are handing them on a plate. They don't want it. They want a different future. and that the future we're handing them on a plate is actually no future. All the modelling we've done, for example, would bear out James Lovelock's, a great scientist, his opinion that the human population probably won't become extinct if we do nothing, but the levels will fall roughly to the levels they were in the year I was born, 1945, where you've got about 2 billion people on the planet and not 7.7 billion people. Wow. This is because of lower fecundity, lower birth rates, problems with food and availability of food and clean water, refugees from climate change, the whole range of factors that together would indicate that we will have a much lower population if we don't do something. I think the younger generation is where I would place my hope rather than incumbent leaders. Even if incumbent leaders knew what to do, which they don't, they wouldn't have the toolkit to enable them to do it. Young people are aware of that and are thinking differently and will do differently. My hope is in young people.
And I can't help but feel, I'm not an academic, but I studied counterculture in the States and into the 60s counterculture. And it was pretty clear that TV coming along just before that period was hugely instrumental in the Alis and the Dylans and all these people that were sort of driving this collective consciousness that happened with Vietnam War and that. And we've moved along, we've got our own challenges now, but rather than social media bringing everybody together to tackle these issues, it seems like it's gone the opposite direction in this day and age.
There's been a dumbing down, certainly.
Absolutely, and people just, they're quite openly fighting with someone who's 8,000 kilometres away from a safe space, and nobody really cares what each other's opinions are. It feels that this dualism is being driven by social media. Do you agree with that, or where do you see that?
In part, yes. I mean, it arose through ancient Greek philosophy, really. I mean, the dualistic instruments, or the instruments of dualism, such as debate, for example, started there, but certainly social media has made the problem of dualism worse. And it's really incredibly important that we become more sophisticated in our thinking. So one of the reasons democracy isn't working, I mean, there are obvious reasons, like no one person can represent the views of so many people because we're so diverse, we're so different. And each one of us might have a whole range of views, from what you might refer to as democratic socialism, for example, which Bernie Sanders is talking about in the States, right through to extreme right-wing thinking, of fascist thinking. But those views are not represented in our democracy, where we're asked to vote for left or right, which is so simplistic as to be utter nonsense today. So until we are able to introduce into governance instruments that allow us to think more freely and more expansively, and not just focus in on either or, then we're not going to get anywhere. Democracy is not going to work. This is why, with the Centre for the Future, our proof of concept project was a thing called My Vote. We decided with My Vote that we wanted to test out. The question really was, is democracy sufficient for our needs? If we can get it to work as well as we can, using smartphone apps and the latest technology, re-engaging people in wanting to contribute their ideas to the direction of their own country and their own society, if we could eliminate all the flaws that we find at the moment in terms of extreme ideological thinking, hijacking the real issues, or corrupt practices like, as we've seen recently with the sports grants given to sporting organisations, which is just feathering the nests of people and electorates that are on the margin. If we could do that really well, and if someone like Steve Jobs was doing the job of designing the app that would go in the smartphone that would give us that information, would it actually be sufficient for our needs today? Would it deal with the slowness of democracy? Would it deal with the complexity of the world? Would it allow people to re-engage effectively and make decisions about the future of their society and their community? I think we've proved pretty much that it wouldn't. I think we need something more than democracy. I forget now what the question was that spurred that, but it's an interesting concept. It's one of those systems that are failing us, and democracy, I'm saying, is failing us. It's not working anywhere in the world. Most of all, it's not working in a place like Australia. It's just not. And if we think that an election every 3 or 4 years to vote in either or is doing the job, then we're severely, it's an illusion. It's not democracy.
I suppose even in terms of the dualism again, though, obviously you've got communist doctrine and you've got capitalist, okay? And obviously we generally tend to look at democracy and capitalism as one in the West.
Well, they are the dual pillars of the society we've built. Yes,
yeah.
certainly.
Like, has anybody actually come up with an alternative to either of those yet? Like, is that in existence, something that's actually viable that your network has been made aware of? Or?
Oh, it's patchy, but there are experiments going on all over the world all the time. I mean, the whole issue of cryptocurrencies, for example, in Bitcoin, and you look at you compare them potentially with the flaws in the fiat system of currency and controlled by central banks, then you'd have to say, if you have half a brain, that at some stage cryptocurrencies are going to be more important than fiat currencies. But yes, there are experiments. There are experiments with peer-to-peer communities, with developing their own systems, their own currencies. Even corporations are starting to do that, of course. There are hybrid models being developed even in places like China. I mean, if I work in China a lot, and what I see in China is it's not communism, it's not socialism, it's a form of market economy, but controlled. And so there are so many different models and modes of expression being tried. What we know isn't working are the mainstream models we've got at the moment, both democracy and capitalism. If you have people like Mark Carney, who's governor of the Bank of England, and Ray Dalio, he's a multi-billionaire and the founder of Bridgewater, one of the biggest funds management companies in the world. And Mark Benioff is another one. He's the CEO of Salesforce, and I think he owns Time magazine. So people in finance who know what's going on globally, but come from both ends of the spectrum in terms of protecting money and making money, and they're saying capitalism has failed. It's not working. It's not working for anyone. Mainly it isn't because of one factor, and that is the socio-economic stratification that allows fewer and fewer people to own the assets and benefit from the assets, and many more people simply working for those people and becoming poorer and poorer, so that this gap between the wealth and the poor is getting wider and wider. It's just extraordinary that at the moment we have allowed that system to evolve into a situation where perhaps, I wouldn't know the exact figure, but perhaps 23, 24, 25 white men basically own as much as half the world does together. So we're talking about 3.6 to 4 billion people own as much as those 24 men.
There's no positive spin you can put on that, obviously.
You can't. No, it's not working. It's simply unsustainable. That's why, I made the outrageous prediction a couple of years ago, which people scoffed at, that sooner or later we're going to have to deal with two aspects of capitalism. One is constant growth. Because in a finite system like the Earth is, you cannot keep going with unlimited growth. It's got to stop. Or you've got to move to inclusive growth, which means you've got to identify where growth makes sense and stop it where it doesn't make sense. And the inequality around the world would indicate to you where you stop it and where you need to continue it. So growth is one factor, and the other factor is the design of the system where one individual can make so much money that it becomes obscene in that context. And so I think governments, sooner or later, singly or collectively, and I don't know where it will start, but as soon as that conversation starts, it will become a flood of people wanting to put a cap on the accumulation of individual wealth. That's bound to happen sooner or later. And also inclusive growth. People are starting to talk about that already, but again, in terms of traditional economics, it's like some kind of alien invasion. We can't go there, it won't work. But of course it will. We invented capitalism, and we can reinvent it.
I think what feeds into that in regards to current technological trends, automation as an example, look, we all know it's coming. Everybody sort of talks it at ground level out there. Everybody knows, well, we know a lot of jobs are going to go in the next 10, 15 years. It's kind of like this thing that we're all talking about, but it almost seems like sci-fi to us, and it really is coming. And I've heard you speak about UBI, Universal Basic Income, before. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, but my question is really around, as we continue to automate and people lose their jobs, people need meaning in their lives, and their work is often it defines us. This is my contribution to the society around me.
That's absolutely right.
This is what mummy does or daddy does for a living, show and tell, whatever. If people lose that, what are they literally going to do? This should be a huge concern for governments, I imagine.
I don't think it is yet.
Okay.
I don't think they've grasped it yet. Certainly in the West, I think in parts of Asia, I would hear those kinds of conversations, possibly in South America, in places where you come up with the kind of thinking that is really exploring what is next, that makes sense. In a pluriverse, not a universe. You see, one of the problems has been that in the West is this notion that there should be one thing, one overarching value, one ethos, one morality. And that's not the case. We're so diverse, humanity is so diverse, that we actually live in a pluriverse, and we should value that richness. So I'm not so sure a lot of Western governments are having those conversations at the moment. A big factor is we actually don't know to what extent jobs will be replaced by other kinds of work as robots take over the work of doctors and lawyers, and so not just blue-collar workers, but the professions. What other work becomes available? And you have to say, from today's perspective, you would have to say, well, work that it has to do with caring and relating to others, and empathy and compassion and creation, artistic work, and all of that becomes more important because machines can't do that yet. Sooner or later, possibly they will be able to do that. I mean, the work in empathy on robots, for example, that is proceeding at such a rate that it's mind-blowing, it really is. So who's to say when that will occur? But when you take away work, what is left? Well, surely the joy of life becomes the real motivator. Why work? There was a brilliant book published just last year by a friend of mine, Peter Merry, in the Netherlands, and it's called Why Work? And the arguments for not going into these human factories where we sit in a chair all day at computer terminals or do these terrible routine tasks that can be done by machines. The argument for not doing that is obvious when we can be sitting on a beach writing a poem,
yeah,
or having a party, or writing music, or writing a play, or actually taking in the richness and the variety and the extraordinary nature of the world we live in. Why work? I mean, it still doesn't answer the question, where will the motivation come from? Because to a great extent, what you're then saying is, if that happens, if that is the case, then the motivation which exists today, which is largely an external motivation, in other words, if I do this task for this organisation, they'll pay me, and that's why I do it. It has to become an internal motivation in what's going to excite me, what's going to attract my attention and keep my attention, and how will I get paid for that? You know, what will be the reward system there, which gets us back to the universal basic income, of course.
Well, and I know you're from an arts background.
Yes.
Originally a musician, I believe.
Originally medicine, but then music from the age of 5. I was a composer and conductor.
Yeah.
And yes, I got to the stage where, well, with medicine, I was working in paediatric oncology at a time when it amounted to nothing more than palliative care. And so emotionally I couldn't hack that, I couldn't deal with it. So I went back to my first love, which was writing music, which I'd been doing since the age of 5, and conducting. And eventually I gave that away simply because I realised that my music, which they dubbed the new complexity, which gives you a fair indication of what it sounded like. It gave the ears a very good bashing indeed. But the people that could actually play this music were fewer and fewer.
Yeah.
And the people who wanted to listen to it, the audience, were fewer and fewer. And eventually, I mean, it's like, it's a kind of musical masturbation. You keep doing it for yourself, really. Having said that, one of the greatest joys I've had recently was a few years ago. I stopped writing music in 1984. The last piece I wrote was called Keat, for a perambulatory percussionist. So all this percussion, and this music theatre piece of this percussionist going around this battery of percussion, playing it. It's quite a funny piece, 24 minutes long, and it was commissioned by a student of mine, and it was pronounced by all percussionists, including the most brilliant percussionists in the country, as totally unplayable. It was just too difficult, too complex, too many demands made on the performer. And yet, 2 or 3 years ago, a student graduating from the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, a percussionist, a woman, decided to perform this piece as her graduating piece. And she played it from memory with a precision and an accuracy that just blew me away. So from 1984 till now, the skills in music performance have just transformed.
Isn't that incredible? Because you would think that they probably wouldn't be that different. It's not like sports where they give you new kit to train on, and they find, it's.
Well, even sport, if you don't, there was a footballer the other day, and I can't remember who it was, a British footballer, I think, but he was saying, if my team, it was in England, if my team was playing the current team, we'd be blown off the pitch.
Yep.
The skills are just
Next
phenomenal.
level.
And so it's across a range of things, I think. But certainly the arts and sport, I mean, the extraordinary nature of skill levels and expertise these days, it just is mind-blowing.
I actually saw that the Liverpool manager has a data scientist working with them now. So they just map out
this is
those
common.
games.
A lot of them do.
Incredible.
Yes.
And they're unstoppable at the moment.
Yes.
I suppose connecting the dots backwards, I'm glad that we moved on to the arts. I don't want to sort of labour this too much, but on the back of the UBI conversation we had, and if people are going to fill their lives with meaning, which isn't necessarily work, it seems that funding in the arts tends to be on the decline at the moment. I'm hearing that less musical instruments generally worldwide are being sold.
Yes.
And it kind of feels like we're inverted there, because if we want to prepare people for a life where automation has taken the working part away from them, we kind of need those skills to be moving upwards so that they can fill their lives with that kind of creativity. Do you agree with that, or do you have any insight?
Yes, I do. Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it, that we're so protective of our economy and wanting growth and development and bring in policies of austerity to achieve a surplus, a budget surplus. To what end if you're not getting enjoyment from life? And what do you get real enjoyment from? Family and friends and entertainment and creation. And so I think we're going through a phase at the moment, you'd have to say it extends globally, where the mechanistic impulse is becoming more and more dominant, and yet it has to collapse if we're really to release the joy of what it means to be human and the essence of that joy. That mechanistic impulse has to collapse to allow us to be once again human. And that's one of the big questions for me, whether are we wise enough to survive our own success? And that question relates to the wisdom of letting go of what brought us success in order to embrace what in the future could bring us joy and happiness and endurance.
I often look at social media. There's all kinds of new different platforms now. There's one called TikTok, which is a video-based one.
I met the founder the other day. I was working in China. We were in Shanghai, and I was doing a gig for the Bank of America on basically their ESG agenda. But as part of it, I joined Future Circle, which is a group of youngsters in China that I'm mentoring, futurists, young kids. They're about 29, 30, and they'd convened this after a whole afternoon for me to talk with entrepreneurs and people from the government and private sector, academics, and a whole mix of people. It was just a real joy. And one of the founders of TikTok actually was there, and I said, "You've got a lot I want to blame you for, because my 8-year-old is on TikTok all the time." And he laughed.
Yeah, I mean, they all are.
Yes.
It's crazy. But I was looking at it and I'm in two minds about it, because first of all, I think, well, you just spent 3 hours on TikTok watching 30-second videos. But I stopped and I thought about it one day, and I thought, look at what they've actually picked up there about physics, animal behaviour. Because when I was their age growing up, and it would have been the same with you, I didn't have that access to what really happens when someone does this and they fall off a roof or whatever it is. And there's so much video and media available now.
Yes.
What we would have sat in a classroom and learned from our professor or whatever it was, they're just seeing in real time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The schools are not needed now.
Just cognitively, they are taking in so much information.
Schools and schooling is one of the problems. We have to dismantle it. Because it's not helping now. It's simply not helping. I'm advising a new school which is opening in Bangkok. It's a new international school called Verso. If people want to look at it, the website is www.verso.school. It's been designed by IDEO, the design company in San Francisco, out of Singapore. So the buildings are extraordinary for a start. The whole campus there are no classrooms. There are going to be no teachers. The whole experience of learning is going to be totally turned upside down. And that's the kind of what schooling has to become if we're going to be able to say it's relevant for the next generation and what is facing the next generation. But schools and schooling today are teaching kids to, well, they're not teaching them for redundancy. I don't know what they're teaching them for. The educational system is irrelevant.
It's like we're just going through the motions, isn't it, really? That's how it...
I suspect because they're lost to know, well, there's so much uncertainty about the future. What can we? How should we educate? But it's obvious. You can create curiosity. You can allow creativity. You can get kids working together in groups for collaborative purpose. There are so many things you can do to turn the educational model on its head to remain relevant for what is coming. But schools and educational systems generally are so locked into the past that they're not doing that. And as Sir Ken Robinson says quite rightly, schooling actually sucks the creativity out of kids. And that's a huge problem going into the future when we're going to need creativity to prevent robots taking over the work that we can do.
Absolutely, 100% agree. And to be honest with you, I feel that to an extent, the corporate world can be the same in regards to their training. I think that we need to, and I know that there is big strides being taken in this area, but we still think that sitting people down in a classroom, firing slides at them, is going to engage them, and they're just going to go out and give you all this discretionary effort from it. And I'm just not convinced, particularly in heavy industry, that model fits every situation anymore. You know, I think micro-learning, and I've seen that in action, where it's gamified, and people just learn real small snippets. It's mobile for them, they compete with other people.
Yes.
It becomes an experience for them then,
yes.
And they get engaged with it.
The experience is everything.
Yeah.
If you look at the collapse of retailing in Australia at the moment, for example, it's collapsing for many reasons. Online is one of those, but it's the dearth of a different experience when you go. I mean, the retail theatre has gone. We need a theatre of retail for it to remain on the street. People don't get that. Retailers don't get that because they're so locked into old business models. But in corporates, in Australia, the stats of staff disengagement are alarming. I mean, if you take the average, then 17% of the people that work for you in a large corporation will be actively working against your strategy. They're so disengaged that they're bitter and resentful about it. And only in an average company, and it doesn't matter whether it's a legal practice or a university or a corporate like a bank, for example, on average, in Australia today, only 24% or less will be absolutely engaged in what they're doing. 24%. That's criminal.
It is. It sounds like a lot of wasted money and energy.
It's very negligent. And yes, they think training is the answer, but it's not. I remember, I don't know whether I should tell this story, but I will, because I don't think he would mind. When David Fodey was the CEO of Telstra, I credit him actually as being a very smart guy and a very good CEO. But the one thing he didn't get was the outpouring of anger in society against Telstra when Telstra tried to deal with customer outrage because, for example, the length of time it took to connect a service or whatever it was. It actually went feral in the community. In other words, it wouldn't have mattered what David Fodey or any of his staff had told customers. It was bad. It was going to be bad news. They would have misinterpreted as bad news. If David Fodey had come out and said, look, we're going to repay you for the bad service you've had. For every bill, we'll reimburse you $100 on that bill. That would have been interpreted as bad news in some form or other. When moral outrage gets to that extent, internal training isn't going to do any good at all. You have to totally rethink that strategy. And I think it was perhaps the only thing that David actually got wrong during his tenure. And I'm not surprised, because I don't know of many CEOs globally that would have picked that. His response was to do what any sensible CEO would do in terms of allocating more money to training and development of staff in order to deal with that customer outrage on the phone. But no, it wasn't that. It was actually out there, gone feral.
Yeah, and I know that you've written a book which is around the 5 literacies of global leaders.
That was my third book, yeah.
Yeah, so...
I'm now up to 8.
Really? I must read them. I'm sorry that I haven't yet, but I'm catching up. I was just wondering, and I realise it's a huge subject and it's not something that can be packaged up too easily, but could you just step us through, because what I have seen in the corporate world is a lot of command and control leadership, particularly in the resources sector. That's just how we get projects done. It seems that there is a lot more open-minded approach now to engaging people, creating an environment where people actually flourish, and then you get far more than you ever hoped for when that happens. Yes. But it's still probably the rarity rather than the norm. Could you step us through those 5 literacies, please? And
the successful companies are actually the companies who do liberate their people to that extent. I remember a few years back now, I took 19 senior executives from one of the banks on an international learning journey, and we went to the West Coast first of America and stayed in a joie de vivre hotel. So every aspect of the journey was learning. What can you learn from the branding of this hotel and the way things are done in this hotel? And it was very intense. We'd do a briefing for the day, then they'd have this experience, and then a really thorough debriefing of that experience, and then we'd move on. And I remember we spent a whole day at Zappos in Las Vegas, where everything is done differently, and the freedom of the staff to do things differently, even in a call centre, where they didn't have scripts, they didn't have a standard amount of time you needed to engage a customer. Extraordinary in terms when comparing with the conventional corporate world, and these executives, the jaws just dropped open because they thought, well, you can't do it this way, and yet Zappos is harder to get into than Harvard University, and it keeps its staff, and boy oh boy is it successful in terms of profitability and shareholder value. And I just remember exposing so many executives during the past 10 years to that kind of environment, and then not getting what you need to lead that, and to be fearful of it. So the 5 literacies are really the kind of domains of knowledge that leaders need in order to be able to let go of that control, that command and control mindset. And they range from things like foresight, where you're able to say, well, in 10 years' time, I want this company to be looking and feeling like this, playing in this space. What will it take to do that? And then backcast to say, well, the decisions we make today need to get us close to that. That's strategic navigation, because circumstances change and you actually have to navigate that passage. It's not a linear A to B. So strategic navigation, in terms of flexibility, it's really strategic management in real time. Another literacy would be branding, in the sense of the whole proposition that this organisation offers, the community of stakeholders it deals with. And there, what your aim is to do is to have those people who are out there, who perhaps are not even customers yet, but certainly customers as well, saying things about you that you want them to say, that you're saying, that you aspire to. So brand value is, I forget what I called it now, isn't that awful? This is a long time ago, 12 years ago and more. But things like that. So these are whole domains of knowledge that you need to acquire in order to provide the kind of leadership that you need to endure and benefit from the kinds of changes coming at you. Strategic intelligence is one of those, of course, because to act on what you think you know is very often the worst thing you can possibly do. But when you've got evidence and it's data driven and you know you need to change tack, then you can do it. We first developed the whole notion of the Five Literacies when we were working at the top level of the Australian Tax Office when Michael Carmody was the Commissioner. It was a beautiful experience. I mean, there were the Tax Office at that time was a real learning organisation. They were thirsty. Their appetite for knowledge and change was extraordinary. And one of the challenges we put to them was the compliance model itself, which is, if you like, the heart of the tax system. And their compliance model at the time was, we don't trust anyone in the Australian community. You're all bastards. You'd all get away with cheating if you could, because that's how we think. So we're going to check everybody's tax return.
Yeah.
And we said, what happens if you invert that? Because you're really stretched to the limit doing that. You're asking the government all the time for more and more resources. You need more and more people. But we did a little exercise where we actually proved to them that introducing the BAS statement was one policy, but you could also do it a different way and reduce the resource requirement by about 2,500 people in the tax office. So, I mean, they actually did reinvent the compliance model, which is when you stopped, your tax return stopped, it was up to you now. And they actually spent their resources doing what they should do, which is going after the big end of town that doesn't pay tax at all.
So just wanted to say thank you very much, Richard Hames, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you and a privilege to get your insight into so many of these issues. And I hope you might consider joining us again.
I certainly will. Thank you, Oliver, for the conversation. It's been a sheer delight.
Thank you. So thanks for watching. You can catch us on Apple Music, on Spotify and on the YouTube channel. You can find out more about Richard at richardhames.com, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. And until then, remember, there is always a better way.